page 421. Excuse me, actually, 420. The reaction of audiences showed how Moses affected them. Invariably, there was more applause at the beginning of a speech than at the end. With each succeeding appearance, the enthusiasm of his audience waned. The number of people who came to hear him fell further and further below the number that had been expected. At a rally in Queens on November 1st, that had been expected to be a high spot of the campaign, only 1 of every 5 seats in the Jamaica High School auditorium was occupied. Moses' last appearance showed how little remained of the public enthusiasm that had greeted his nomination. That enthusiasm had persuaded his campaign managers to rent the state's largest auditorium, Madison Square Garden, for a climactic rally on the Saturday night before Election Day. So certain had they been of an overflow crowd that to avoid unseemly jams at the entrance, they had printed tickets to be distributed in advance by local GOP organizations, and had announced that no one would be admitted without a ticket and that the doors would be closed a half hour before the speeches began. Oh, this is going to be so exciting. On the night before the rally, stacks of tickets remained untouched in GOP clubhouses. Despite a frantic last-day effort to persuade local Republicans to take them and agree to show up, despite a decision to leave the doors of the garden open even during speeches themselves in hopes that passers-by might wander in, far less than half of the garden's 25,000 seats were filled. The people who were present were so dispirited that when George Everett, a professional cheer and song leader, took the microphone at a few minutes past 8 to warm up the crowd, he asked them why they were so downhearted. When the candidate rose to speak, he saw, looming down on him from the balcony, thousands of empty seats. The arrangements committee had placed a small American flag on each seat on the garden floor below him to be waved by its occupant, and he saw staring at him a sea of flags rather than a sea of faces. And there, in front of the empty seats, spotlighted in the center of the cavernous, half-empty arena, the candidate stood, pounding his palm hard on the lectern, lashing out in a voice loud and angry, almost ranting, the featured performer of a program that, the Times reported, was marked by more attacks on personalities than any similar meeting in recent political history. At the polls, the verdict of the people was even clearer. It was Lehman, 2,201,729, Moses, 1,393,638. Robert Moses, the candidate of the party favored by an overwhelming majority of the state's voters, a candidate for whom the Herald Tribune reported the GOP waged the hardest campaign that party has waged for a state ticket in a half dozen years, which actually isn't that many years. A candidate who had entered the campaign on the very crest of a wave of favorable publicity that had been 10 solid years in building, lost by more than 800,000 votes. His percentage of the votes cast, 35%, was the smallest percentage polled by a gubernatorial candidate of any major party in the 157-year history of New York State. As George Fearon had predicted, he dragged his party to defeat with him. For the first time in 21 years, the GOP lost both houses of the state legislature. Parentheses, the GOP won back the assembly the next year and didn't lose it again for another 29 years, until the Lyndon Johnson landslide of 1964. The year in which Robert Moses headed the Republican ticket was, in other words, the only election in a 50-year span in which the GOP lost both houses. Hey, look who it is over behind the shelf. He lost upstate communities that no Republican candidate for any office had ever lost before. He even ran behind Lehman in the total upstate vote. This fact so astonished veteran political reporters that they refused to believe the unofficial election night tallies that first revealed it. Pearl, would you like to join us for the Power Broker? The old guard, which had foisted Moses's candidacy upon the GOP, was adequately punished. Its influence would remain strong in the party, but county leaders who couldn't afford to let their local candidates be caught in the undertow of the sinking of a poor candidate and who were determined that one as poor as Moses should never again head the ticket, would never let the old guard handpick another candidate. His candidacy was its Waterloo. Moses was, in later years, to attempt to alibi away his defeat by saying that he had simply been one of many candidates caught in the landslide vote by which the nation in 1934 expressed its approval of Franklin D. Roosevelt. On the day after the election, he told an interviewer, "I said when I went into the campaign that I did so knowing it was an attempt to swim up Niagara." No one, he said, could have beaten a New Deal supporter in New York State in 1934. This is true in part. The New Deal landslide of 1934 swept right-wingers to defeat all across the country. But Moses' explanation does not account for the size of his defeat. His previous popularity, the top-heavy GOP registration in the state, the lavish financing of his campaign, all these factors had led keen political observers like Baron Warren. If you're a keen political observer and your name is Baron Warren, that's perfect. To predict at the time of his nomination a campaign that would be close no matter what the national trend. It was, these observers concluded after Election Day, the reaction of voters to personal, not party, philosophy, as well as to Moses' personality that had eroded the support with which he entered the campaign. Swimming up Niagara was one way to look at Moses' campaign. In brilliance of strategy and execution, it was perhaps more comparable to the charge of the Light Brigade. The definitive word comes from Joseph McGoldrick. McGoldrick was running on Moses' ticket, but since he was running for a city office, comptroller, only in the city. At the beginning of the campaign, he was approached by a pollster named Harry Gordon Lynn, whom politicians, including Al Smith, regarded as amazingly accurate. Quote, "Lynn was doing the polling secretly for Lehman, but he came to me and said for $2,000, as long as he was doing it for Lehman, he would do it for me at the same time," McGoldrick recalls. Lynn's first report to me was that Moses would lose the city by 550,000, but I would win it by 75,000. He said, "Moses is going to be defeated, but don't worry, you'll win." The second week, he said Moses would lose by 600,000, but I'll still win by 50,000. The third week, it was 700,000 and 25,000. And on the Friday before election, he came in and said, "Boss, you can't make it. Moses is going to lose the city by 800,000 votes, and you can't overcome that. You're going to lose by about 25,000. And that's approximately what happened. I lost by 23,000. Moses needn't have lost by nearly as great a margin as he did, McGoldrick says. In fact, if Moses had held his deficit in the city to the 550,000 figure at which it stood in the beginning of the campaign, and had retained the normal GOP support upstate, he might well have won the election, for GOP candidates normally come down to the city line, compiled a margin above the northern boundary of the Bronx, with an edge of more than 600,000 votes. It was his tactics and personality, not national attitudes toward the New Deal, that persuaded tens of thousands of potential supporters to vote against him. He booted that campaign himself, McGoldrick would say flatly. It was a disaster. He made it one. Yeah, we're finally getting like British things. Waterloo, that's nearby you-ish. On election night, Moses was careful to show an elaborate disregard of the vote. Also, sorry, I feel like I need to clarify. Never mind. Anyway, on election night, Moses was careful to show an elaborate disregard of the vote. Reporters ushered into his apartment at 7 Gracie Square saw him poring over a map of the city, outlining park and playground projects while he whistled softly and giving only perfunctory attention, apparently, to the election returns relayed to him. I haven't the slightest regrets in any way, shape, or manner, he said. I've done the best I could. I've conducted an honorable campaign and adhered to my convictions. That's all there is to do. And he said that he was planning to return to his park work the next morning. There was there was no question about his returning to his city job, of course, but the fact that he included in the statement his state park work showed that he knew Herbert Lehman much better than his campaign attacks on the governor would have made it appear. For Lehman's treatment of Moses after the campaign was the definitive word on the governor's character. No sooner had the landslide aspects of his defeat of Moses become apparent than the Daily News, whose publisher was temporarily feuding with Moses, called on Lehman to oust his disloyal subordinate. And so did key legislators and a number of the governor's most influential supporters, including Farley and Flynn, and, according to some sources, President Roosevelt. They're all like, get rid of Moses, he sucks. Now, with Moses' prestige, his previously invulnerable armor against ouster moves, riddled with holes, was the time to bring pressure on the members of the State Parks Council to elect another chairman, they said. Al Smith heard what was going on and hurried over to Lehman's apartment at 820 Park Avenue to urge the governor not to move against Moses. He needn't have bothered. Lehman was so bitterly hurt by Moses' charges, but he would not allow personal feelings to interfere with his duty. We have differed in the past and probably will again in the future, but in the planning and administration of parks, parkways, and recreational facilities, Bob Moses has no superior on the face of the world, the governor announced. Moses could continue to head the state park system as long as he was governor, he said. He was terribly sensitive because he said I called him a liar in the campaign, Moses would recall. But I found him a very nice fellow to deal with, a very decent, honorable, honest fellow. He always supported me when he was governor. Moses should have known that Lehman would support him. After all, the, quote, cowardly, sniveling, lying weakling had always supported him before. Why did Robert Moses, previously so talented at public relations, antagonize the public during the episode in his career in which he needed the most support? In part because his success in public relations had been due primarily to his masterful utilization of a single public relations technique, identifying himself with the popular cause. This technique was especially advantageous to him because his philosophy, that accomplishment, getting things done, is the only thing that matters, that the end justifies any means, however ruthless. His philosophy might not be universally popular. By keeping the public eye focused on the cause, the end, the ultimate benefit to be obtained, the technique kept the public eye from focusing on the methods by which the benefit was to be obtained. The technique was also especially advantageous to him because its focus on the cause kept his personality safely blurred. Moses' use of technique was a totally conscious one. Knowing precisely what he was doing, the first rule is to stay on the side of the angels. He continually urged reporters, under the guise of modesty, to stick to the parks and playgrounds and bridges and don't write about me. And he had consistently made sure that his instructions were followed by furnishing only bare, carefully selected facts about himself. From the moment in 1925 when he dramatically propelled himself into the public consciousness by announcing that he was fighting for parks against a little group of selfish millionaires, he had identified himself so thoroughly with the glowing cause of parks that for 9 years the public had seen him always through that glow. Everything he did, he said, was in the name of parks. and of course, of parkways and bridges that helped people reach the parks. And the public believed this. After a while, he began, also consciously, to identify himself with related battles against crooked politicians and red-taping bureaucrats. And so cleverly did he make this additional identification that the public accepted it too. During those years, the public never saw Robert Moses the man. But in a race for public office, the public focus is more on the individuals involved. Causes championed by a candidate are important to voters, but mainly as they help illuminate his personality and philosophy. It was a man they were voting for, not a constitutional amendment. They wanted to see the man. Hello, welcome. We're talking about how, Moses just really got absolutely obliterated in his run for governor because he made speeches and people realized that he sucks, basically. And so we're talking about how before everyone liked him, but not because of anything about him, just because he made the parks. And he hid the unseemly aspects of his personality that would have probably turned the public against him. Okay, where was I? This explanation, of course, does not answer another question. Why couldn't a man as skilled as Moses at manipulating and charming people he needed charm the voters now that they needed them? Now that he needed them. Conceal from them his philosophy and personality, persuade them, at least for a period of a few weeks, that he understood and sympathized with their aims and aspirations and wanted to help them achieve those aims. Why couldn't he keep the voters from knowing, at least for a period of a few weeks, what he thought of them? The answer to this question lies somewhere deep in Robert Moses's nature. In part, it lies in the arrogance that was that nature's most striking manifestation. Robert Moses's arrogance was first of all intellectual. He had consciously compared his mental capacity with other men's and had concluded that its superiority was so great that it was a waste of time for him to discuss, to try to understand, or even listen to their opinions. But there was more to his arrogance than that. Had it been merely a product of consciously reasoned comparison, it would have been governable by reason that must have informed him that if he hoped to win the prize he so desperately wanted, he must, for a period of a few weeks, conceal his contempt for the public. Had his arrogance been merely intellectual, he could have disciplined himself. This man with a will strong enough to discipline himself to a life of unending toil, for the few weeks necessary to give him a chance at the governorship. But his arrogance was emotional, visceral, a driving force created by heredity and hardened by living, a force too strong to be tamed by intellect, a force that drove him to do things for which there is wholly no rational explanation, like closing the Central Park Casino. It wasn't just that Robert Moses didn't want to listen to the public, it was that he couldn't listen, couldn't, even for the sake of the power he coveted, try to make people feel that he understood and sympathized with them. Wow, he just hates people. And there was something else behind Robert Moses' arrogance, a strange flickering shadow. For not only could Robert Moses not help showing his contempt for others, he seemed actually to take pleasure in showing this contempt. A deep, genuine pleasure, a pleasure whose intensity leads to the suspicion that, in a way, he needed to display his superiority with a need so great that he simply could not dissemble it. How else to explain the fact that... Sorry, David's talking over there. Let's see if I can communicate with a stare. Can you hear him talk? It's loud to me, but maybe it's not loud to you guys. I don't know. What is the Power Broker about? Oh my goodness. It is about a guy named Robert Moses who starts out as like a little guy who's trying to make more parks in New York City, but then he gradually becomes more and more evil, more and more racist, but then he does kind of get a lot of power and build like all the bridges, most of the buildings, all the parks. And he's kind of famous for holding 3 city positions that each have different terms. And so like when a new governor comes, the new governor isn't allowed to oust him from all of his offices. Like he's always like there's always some holdover. Yeah. It's really long. You can watch the first like what 50 something, but I think a summary on Wikipedia is probably a better use of your time unless you're really invested. Okay, where was I? The little we were talking about the strange flickering shadow. How else to explain the fact that, even when he was appearing before the public to ask for its support, he could not help ostentatiously flaunting condescension and boredom? Boredom even at its applause. Robert Moses may, moreover, have understood that he had this need. He may have understood that he would not be able to appear before voters without having to show them so clearly that there could be no mistake about it how much he despised them. For such self-knowledge would explain, and it is difficult to find another explanation, his decision to shun, to so perhaps unprecedented an extent, all public appearances save for a few formal speeches. Such an explanation also helps to illuminate Moses's otherwise almost inexplicable treatment of the press. Nobody understood the press and how to manipulate it better than he. And therefore he must have known intellectually that he would forfeit its support he both needed and wanted, if he attacked reporters personally and directly. Something far stronger than intellect, something stronger than considerations of strategy, stronger even than a chance for the governorship, was driving him. Something that made it simply impossible for him to accept criticism, even the discreetly implied criticism of the reporter's questions at his very first press conference. As for the vilification that he spewed over his opponent and everyone connected with him, former friends as well as enemies, it is difficult to escape the conclusion that the explanation for this, too, lay in character rather than campaign tactics. Since his earliest days in power, Moses had tried not just to defeat, but to destroy anyone who stood in his way, by any means possible. The definitive word on Robert Moses's gubernatorial campaign may be an unconsciously revealing remark that Moses made years later to his friendly biographer, Cleveland Rogers. I made the only kind of campaign I knew how to make. Okay, chapter 22, order number 129. I think I'm probably going to stop because it's just so convenient to end on a chapter. It's also such a nice day out. I should probably go, I don't know, go look at the sun. See you later. If you are a Pearl fan, here she is sitting on a notebook. That's all. Goodbye.